1913 is one of the most pivotal years in American history. In fact, it's the year that I claim the American Republic died. Who was at the helm that year? None other than Woodrow Wilson. Was he the worst president in American history? All that and more. Stay tuned. So I wanted to take a look at, when we looked at that year 1913, there's one figure that's really tied to it, which I thought was really interesting. So I wanted to just give credit where credit's due first and foremost. So I did a lot of research on some things I already did know, but I also did some backgrounders on things I didn't know. And I watched, in addition to reading a bunch of articles, I watched a really good video by a YouTube channel called Biographics about Woodrow Wilson. And that's who we're going to discuss today, because I think if you look at it, much of what we're dealing with as America is because of Woodrow Wilson. So I want to take a look at what things happened, what things occurred, and what that means for us as a country. Because there's a few really good things that came out of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. The first being women's suffrage. Yes, we should all be equal, and I believe that's true. A lot of workers' rights were changed around, which, people shouldn't be working in sweatshops. Workers' conditions should be good. I think those are good things. But the bad things that Wilson did that we're still dealing with to this day have outweighed so much more than the good he did. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Wilson, what occurred during his presidency, and what things we should be taking a look at. And this is kind of a follow-up on our episode on 1913. If you haven't seen the video we did on 1913, be sure to check that out. But Woodrow Wilson, interestingly enough, I learned a lot about him. I was really shocked to learn as much about him as I did. The first being, so he was born February 3rd, 1924 in Virginia. And it's interesting because I'm from New Jersey. So we always had thought, okay, yeah, Woodrow Wilson, it's our fault, guys. We're here in New Jersey. We're sorry. Because later in life, before he was president, he would be the president of Princeton University here in New Jersey. And to me, I had never really looked further into it than that. I had never really looked into it more than that. Now, when I looked into it, the thing that was surprising to me was his father was actually born in Ohio, and during the Civil War moved to the South to be a Confederate chaplain. So he actually marched with the Confederate Army, and Wilson himself, as a boy, I believe of 6 years old, had witnessed Sherman's march to the sea. So the Civil War was actually very impactful on him, and he had actually lived through Reconstruction, a lot of these different things, before he comes and studies at Stanford. So I thought that background was really interesting, because I think it explains a lot about the man, and it explains a lot about what the man had lived through and why he reacted in the ways he did. Another thing I thought was extremely interesting was his doctoral dissertation was on scrapping the American form of government, a bicameral legislature and three equal branches of government, and making it more like a British monarchical system, which to me, wow, because if you look at what happened during his term as president, we very much centralized during that time period. So Wilson's idea was much more on centralizing of power. He wanted to centralize power, and he's done that in every different sphere of what he did as being president and working up to being president. So that's the first and foremost thing, which I thought was extremely interesting. So then looking at it, excuse me, I got some good coffee here. But looking at it then, how did we get here? So he actually became governor of New Jersey because they were looking for someone that wasn't really connected to the power structure in New Jersey. Because we've always been corrupt as hell here in New Jersey. I'm sorry to tell you. I always get people telling me I should move to Florida or Texas or something like that. We've been corrupt as heck here in New Jersey. And they brought him in as somebody that would kind of be outside of the power. And what happened is he actually centralized power even more in the state. And then he runs for president later on. And I was listening to a conversation with Charlie Kirk over the weekend, actually, as I was writing the format for this. And that's actually what got me looking more into Wilson, and there had been a lot of interest from you guys about 1913. So I'm like, okay, so we've covered that. Let's look at this. And he goes, you actually have Teddy Roosevelt to thank for Wilson becoming president. I'm like, whoa, what does that mean? I had totally forgot about the election in 1912. So in 1912, we have Theodore Roosevelt, who at that point in time, he'd been a 2-term president. He had gotten power after William McKinley was assassinated in office. So Roosevelt resumes office. He gets elected again. And then he wants to run for another term. And the Republican Party decides they're not going to support him. They're actually going to support William Howard Taft, a Republican from Ohio. I believe he'd been a president in, when was he president? 1909 to 1913. Okay, cool. So he was in office at this point in time, and I guess Roosevelt's coming back. And then he becomes Chief Justice of the United States. I think he was the only president to actually do that, and he sits on the Supreme Court until 1930. But anyway, so William Howard Taft gets the party's nomination, which makes sense, right? He was the previous president, so he wants to get reelected. So then Theodore Roosevelt wants to run, and the Republican Party at that point in time won't give him their nomination. They nominate Taft to run against Woodrow Wilson. So then Theodore Roosevelt decides he's going to run as a third party, and he runs as what's called the Bull Moose Party. So this is where it gets really interesting, because if you look at it, Woodrow Wilson wins 41% of the popular vote. Theodore Roosevelt gets 27%. Third place is William Howard Taft at 23%. And then Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate, gets 6%, which that's really interesting too for basically a third-party candidate. We have 2 third-party candidates in this election. It's kind of wild. But if you combine those two numbers, 27% plus 23%, that's 50%. So they actually beat Wilson by almost 8%. It's or almost 9%. It's 8.2% they actually would have beat him by, but they split the vote. And there's only 2 states that even go for Taft, which is really interesting. So we get Wilson because the vote gets split, which is really interesting that happens. So we get Wilson in office. And then that's in 1912, that magical or not so magical year, if you guys have listened to the episode, happens, which is the year of 1913.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
The Wellness Company and their doctors are medical professionals you can trust. And their new medical emergency kits are the gold standard when it comes to keeping you safe and healthy. This medical emergency kit contains an assortment of life-saving medications, including ivermectin, Z-Pak. Rest assured, knowing that you have emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasitics on hand to help you and your family stay safe from whatever life throws at you next.
So you can support the Wellness Company by heading over to twc.health/JRS. That is twc.health/JRS. Get up to 15% off select products. Support the Wellness Company and help support this show. Thanks again.
So let's take a look at some of the things that happened during Wilson's presidency that makes me say he's the worst president in our history. So in 1913, we have the Income Tax Amendment, which passes, which is the 16th Amendment. We have the 17th Amendment that passes. That is where the state legislatures no longer select the Senate. They are selected by popular vote. So what happens is now the Senate doesn't really serve a purpose, because previously the Senate was the state legislature's representatives to the government, which actually, if you look at even this, election crisis we had in 2020, it would have lined up a lot differently, because the state Senate would have had, or the state Senate, the state legislatures would have had something to say about it, because the Senate would have had something to say about it. But since the Senate in this way is just like having basically a second Congress, nothing to do about it. So to me, that really deteriorates what we are as a republic. And the final thing is the Federal Reserve. We no longer have control of the minting or control of our own money. So those are 3 major things that all happened in the first year. And if you remember going back to Wilson's idea, he always wanted to centralize power. That was always what Wilson wanted to do, was centralize power. And that's really, if you look at the way the presidency functions, remember, he liked a more monarchical system as the system in the UK. That's what happened. This is where the president becomes the most powerful figure, which even grows under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. But this is kind of the genesis of it. So those 3 things happened in 1913. Not all of them were his doing, as some were in motion before that time, but they all pass under him. So that's quite interesting. So Wilson runs for his second term in 1916, and he runs under the mantra of "He kept us out of war." And in 1917, not long after his inaugural address, the U.S. actually enters into the First World War. I'm torn on that because I don't like war, but I also don't like people dying, and I don't like things like that happening. But once again, he runs on I'm not going to take you to war, and he takes people to war. So that's interesting. But it's actually the results of the war that then set up what's going to happen for the Second World War. But we'll get to that in a second. Another thing that Wilson really gets hammered for are two acts, because now that we're in the war, he's concerned of who's going to speak out against the war effort. So there's two acts that pass called the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. So I have an article here from digitalhistory.edu. In his war message to Congress, President Wilson had warned that the war would require a redefinition of national loyalty. There were, quote, millions of men and women of German birth and native sympathy who live amongst us, end quote. He said, quote, there should be disloyalty. It will be dealt with a firm hand of repression, end quote. So in 1917, Congress passes the Espionage Act. This piece of legislation gave the postal officials the authority to ban newspapers and magazines from the mail and threatened individuals convicted of obstructing the draft with $10,000 fines and 20 years in jail. Congress passed the Sedition Act in 1918, which made it a federal offense to use disloyal, profane, or scurrilous language. I'll have to define that one for myself. Or abusive language about the Constitution, the government, the American uniform, the flag. The government prosecuted over 2,100 people under these acts. Political dissenters have borne the brunt of this, including Eugene V. Debs, who was, if we remember back to that election of 1912, was one of his opponents, so he jailed his opponent. He actually spent nearly 3 years in prison. And he also sent another socialist to jail, Kate Richards O'Hare, served a year in prison. So that's really interesting because that's once again going back to the goal of what Wilson wanted to do was centralizing power, right? And so it became a crime to basically speak out against the government during this, which is very, very interesting. So then what happens with the war? Obviously, Germany loses the war, and we have the Treaty of Paris that comes out of it. And the Treaty of Paris, which then ends the war, is a big part of what creates the next war. And we have the 14 points, which is the big idea that comes out of Wilson. So in Europe, he's seen a peacemaker, whereas here, we do look at him a little differently because we look at a lot of domestic policy and things like that. But after the war, he proposes something called the League of Nations, which Congress votes down. He also proposes the settlement, which then really was one of the motivating factors for Germany to start the Second World War, because it leads to the economy falling apart, hyperinflation. Now, I'm not saying there should be no penalty for war, but at the same time, we should look at what are the effects of what we're doing and what is it going to create. So getting back to the League of Nations, it's voted down by Congress, and then what happens is Wilson decides he's going to go to the people. So he goes on a national speaking tour in 1920. After 1919, this fails to go past Congress, and he then speaks in all these different cities. He ends up having a stroke. And this is the fall of 1919. I think it was like October or something like that. It's not widely known by the American people that he's had a stroke, and we actually don't find out until February of 1919. So during that time, his wife Edith, his second wife, had been helping to cover up a lot of what had happened, covering half his body with a blanket to show that there was kind of nothing happening there. There's been thoughts of, was she actually acting as president during this time period? We don't know that. So there's kind of this whole thing happening, which is very interesting because now we have kind of this lame duck president. Makes you think about the current White House. But anyway, it's kind of like Weekend at Bernie's over there. But I guess coming back to it then, he would actually only live another 4 years until 1924. Women's suffrage passes in 1920, in August of that year, which, mind you, I said is a very good thing. I think we should all be equal. But there's also a lot of divisiveness in Wilson, as well, as the first movie to actually show in the White House showed in the Wilson White House, and it was Birth of a Nation, about the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. I don't think that's a movie that should be shown in our White House. But needless to say, if you look at a lot of our situation and what we're dealing with now, we can blame a lot of it on Woodrow Wilson. You know, those three things that all happened in 1913. He was president, though newly elected, when those happened. A lot of what he did around the war created this more centralizing of power. And then a lot of how he ruled the country during that period of time, centralized power. So I think if you look at it, if you had to look at kind of the major point of when power became most centralized in America, it changed dramatically during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. I really recommend that you go check out more of this on your own. But these are a few things that I think you should understand about Woodrow Wilson. As I said, it centralizes a bit more under FDR, but this is really the point, the culmination point, if you had to look at how did we get the country we have today. So thank you so much for hanging out. You guys can get the show notes for this episode and everything mentioned in this episode over at jeremyryanslate.com/1110. Thank you once again for subscribing to the channel. Please hit the subscribe button below. Hit the like button as well. Share us with your family and friends. Help us make a bigger impact. And thank you for your time today. Have a good one, everybody.